Hey everybody. Well, this is getting to be too often of an occurrence, but we lost another great one today. Ozzy Osbourne died. I just read about it a few minutes ago, and I just wanted to make a few comments, particularly my own personal reflections on Black Sabbath, having grown up as a Christian kid in an evangelical community back in the 1970s, which in some ways was the heyday of evangelical Christianity. And I just remember Black Sabbath being, almost a kind of a cultural point as well as a music group back then. So I just kind of wanted to share some of my thoughts on Ozzy Osbourne. I hope you'll consider watching. Yeah, I do have a little bit of Black Sabbath vinyl. I know I've got Master of Reality up there, and I'm pretty sure I have Paranoid. In fact, if you look through my old videos, I did a video on Satanism at the Grammys. Who was that artist a year or two ago that did a satanic selection at the Grammys, dressed like the devil or something? I made a video about that, and I showed Master of Reality, so I know for a fact I have that up there, and I'm pretty sure I have Paranoid too, which is the album I would say is the definitive Black Sabbath album, I would say, at least of the ones I grew up with, and that's definitely the one I remember hearing. In fact, that's kind of ironic. I mentioned my Christian background. Black Sabbath, I was introduced to Black Sabbath in junior high at United Methodist Fellowship in Metro Detroit at a little church. We had a retreat. That's where I heard Cheech and Chong. This older guy brought his stereo in, and we sat around and listened to all kinds of records in that retreat. And the Methodists didn't seem to mind. Now, a little later in high school, we went Baptist for quite a while. That would definitely not have been okay at the Baptist retreat. But we heard, but that's where I heard Paranoid, and I just remember thinking how good it sounded. But I do have this album I fished out. I found it, and it's "We Sold Our Souls for Rock and Roll." This is one I did not have when I was a kid, but I remember it. I went over to my friend's house. This would probably be around 75, and I just remember we listened to this album on a Friday night, and that was in Wheaton, Illinois, maybe 76, 77, I guess. But anyway, it was in the mid-70s. And, when I lived in Wheaton, Illinois, Wheaton at that time was a leading area of evangelical Christianity. And I literally went to school with some of the kids of some of the leading evangelical families in the whole country. Really, people that, were in book publishing and things like that. But even politics sometimes. But I remember this kid. It was Friday night, and we were up in his room, and he put this album on. And I just remember looking at that album cover and it freaking me out, that woman in a coffin, look how dark she looks. Funny thing about that, I remembered this as being blue and in color. It's funny how time takes a toll, because it's one of those album covers you see and you never really forget. There's certain album covers you always kind of remember, and this is one of them. But I hadn't seen the album in years, and when I got it and I opened it, and I bought this at a flea market like several years back. But when I looked at it, I was kind of surprised to see it was in black and white. But anyway, look, it's kind of a vampiric looking. She looks like she's in a coffin. Uh-oh, she's got her eyes open. That's never a good thing, is it? Look. Uh-oh. But I just remember listening to this album other times too, but particularly that night. And this guy put this on, and I don't know, there may have been a black light involved, a few beanbag chairs, I don't remember, but we were listening to this album, and I just remember how dark it sounded, and then kind of looking at this picture, and it really kind of freaked me out. Uh, in fact, you know what? I'm a parent now, and I'm not even sure that's good. I just the Black Sabbath was definitely one of those early '70s bands that had a dark edge. I mean, they were a dark band. I mean, their music was really dark, that mystical, kind of alluring, but that dark, kind of scary feeling. And their music used to be kind of scary. I remember it actually literally scaring me when I was like 15 or 16, like a horror movie or something. It's funny, of the bands that had a dark edge in that period, I would say, Led Zeppelin could definitely have that in a lot of their music. And another one would be the Stones. That was a very hedonistic time. There was a lot of hedonism and things in the early '70s. I don't even think, and by the mid '70s it wasn't like that, but in the early '70s, it was kind of coming out of Woodstock, and there were all kinds of things that were on the mainstream then that would not be okay today. I remember even in seventh and eighth grade seeing things in my junior high, like in kids sitting in class with me, with like hard substances and things. I mean, I can't imagine that today, kids in seventh grade, I don't think that would, at least any of the communities I'm around nowadays, that would definitely not be okay. But I mean, I just saw all kinds of things in the seventh grade. And I think the early '70s, there was that kind of hedonism, darkness, decadence, and a lot of licentiousness, and also some substances that tended to go along with that. So I'm definitely not even advocating that. I definitely, don't think that that's a good thing. But I remember, but you can hear it in that music, that kind of darkness, and you can hear the power of it. Oh, but the funny thing is that, Black Sabbath had a darkness, but I would say they were also kind of like the horror movies back then. I was thinking in particular some of those great old Hammer horror films where the horror was kind of religious. And I would say Black Sabbath's music was kind of religious. It was kind of gothic, like goth rock. I don't know, like years before Marilyn Manson, Black Sabbath was goth rock. But it was kind of religious, and it was also kind of a sense of good and evil. And you know what? That's not a bad thing. I wish we had more of a sense of good and evil in the struggle between good and evil, because I'm not always that sure how literally to take things theologically or whatever, but I definitely believe in the struggle between good and evil, and I want to be a force for good in the world, as I'm sure most of us do, however we would interpret that. And I do think that Black Sabbath was kind of one of those bands that had a really dark edge, but it was kind of like a horror movie where it was also good and evil. And over the years, I think Ozzy Osbourne has kind of come out as being for the forces of good, which is sort of ironic, because when I was a kid, they were one of the taboo bands, if in some of those more religious circles. I just remember, I would when I was in high school, I actually would hear sermons and things that were, very they would denounce rock and roll. Our youth pastor once gave me a book. It was called Rock and Roll, the Devil's Diversion, and it was by Bob Larson or Bruce Larson. I'll stand corrected, but it was Rock and Roll, the Devil's Diversion. It was actually kind of a fun book because he was a Christian. A lot of people today would call him a right-winger Christian, but he was a Christian, and he went through all the, a lot of music. I remember he talked about Eric Clapton and Cream in some sections and different songs, and he'd explain why this is bad. You shouldn't let your kids listen to this song. But he walked through it and went through all the lyrics of these songs and even some of the rhythms they used and how the rhythms were like jungle rhythms and were going to make your kids want to, cavort in the woods or something. But that book was pretty interesting. But he definitely had a lot to say about Black Sabbath. And I also heard some sermons at that time, and that were about rock and roll. And I don't cut down Christians. A lot of people do. I don't cut down Christians. Those are good people. I don't cut down other faiths. And kind of, so I guess I expect the same, because every faith has their different, different areas of belief and things. But I'm just thinking back. I heard it at a youth retreat one time. This guy gave a sermon on rock and roll, and he was talking about Mick Jagger and how Mick Jagger was. And this was kind of like the goat's head soup, the early to mid '70s period. And and that at that time, Mick Jagger would wear a little bit of eye shade one time, and I guess there was one tour where there was like an inflatable phallus on stage or something. Isn't that right? Around that time, and this minister was up there denouncing that, and of course the connotation was, this is homosexuality. The Stones are going to lead your kids into the sin of homosexuality, but I remember him talking about Mick Jagger and his eye shade and that inflatable phallus. And which is kind of funny, because looking back at it now that the smoke is cleared, I don't really associate the Stones with homosexuality. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women, maybe, but not homosexuality. I don't know if that's much better, but anyway, but boy, oh boy, if you thought he didn't like the Stones and their sexuality and their sexual themes, boy, oh boy, you wouldn't want to hear him talk about Black Sabbath. That was just, if you were listening to Black Sabbath, that was, you were worshiping the devil. You were just terrible, and that music should you should burn those albums. It was like, well, an occult, like a Ouija board or something. Don't even have it in your house, I mean, and it was really serious. And you know what? I'm not making fun of that. I'm here kind of laughing, but I'm really not making fun of that, because what does the Bible say? Whatsoever is pure, whatsoever is true, whatsoever is wholesome, what is uplifting and positive, think on these things. And I think that's good advice. And over the years, I think that's good. So I'm not even making fun of that minister or what he was saying. I imagine some of you would not agree with him. It'd be kind of easy to make fun of for a lot of people today. But you know what? The underlying point is we should have positive, wholesome, uplifting images that fill our mind. And I don't really think that's bad advice, actually. Looking back on my life anyway, filling your mind with a lot of dark, eerie, evil images isn't necessarily psychologically healthy, or maybe spiritually healthy, some people would say. But at any rate, I definitely remember that this guy didn't like, boy, oh boy, he didn't like the Stones. And I think he mentioned that this was right around the David Bowie period too. And Rod Stewart, that was another one. They were kind of getting it for their androgyny, in the early '70s. And Rod Stewart's another one. You might associate him with, hundreds of women, but I wouldn't say all that much homosexuality. I don't know, but anyway, I remember, now that I'm remembering, I think Rod Stewart was in that message too. But boy, oh boy, a Black Sabbath was just, there was nothing redeeming about Black Sabbath. I remember talking to that guy about Cat Stevens, and he really didn't like Cat Stevens too much, because he was pantheistic and kind of Eastern mysticism, like on Catch Bullet 4 or Buddha in the Chocolate Box. And of course, Cat Stevens ended up converting to Islam, whereas I would find a lot of nice spirituality in Cat Stevens. A little more diffuse form of spirituality, but spirituality nonetheless. But anyway, if he didn't like Cat Stevens, you just knew. You didn't even have to ask him what he thought about Black Sabbath. I mean, that was just like, don't even go there. And I still, I miss that guy. It's like a lot of people in your life, coaches or something. Some of those people could they're all right. I'm just thinking about that preacher, but he definitely had an influence on me for a while there. But boy, oh boy, he didn't like Black Sabbath. You didn't even want to bring it up. I mean, just the name. At least Led Zeppelin, you could kind of, you'd have to fish through some albums and find something. Jimmy Page. What's this? some of this mysticism. What are these runic symbols on Led Zeppelin 4? You had to dig around in Led Zeppelin, but Black Sabbath, just the name alone was like, no way, no freaking way. But which is it's kind of funny. But over the years, I actually kind of agree with that, at least in the larger sense. Do fill your mind with positive, wholesome things, and certainly a lot of good music out there that's positive and wholesome. Although I still enjoy a good horror movie, as long as it's not all gory and just full of jerks and startles and splatters and things. I enjoy a good horror movie, and I think that goes back to that period. And it was the same period where I learned to enjoy Led Zeppelin, and some of those bands that did have kind of a darker edge. The Grateful Dead had kind of a dark edge sometimes. Just it was how they played. There was a certain sound to it, that dark edge. It wasn't necessarily their lyrics or what they were trying to do. There was a kind of spirit in the music. Maybe I'm thinking what that minister would have said, but there was a kind of spirit in the music that was dark, Maybe it was the drugs. I don't know, but the last thing I wanted to say about Ozzy is he's kind of one of those guys that we never took too seriously. I think Keith Richards is like that. Who else is like that? Willie Nelson. We kind of make all their jokes, the Willie Wagon, and and Keith Richards. People make all their Keith Richards jokes, and Ozzy was kind of like that. It used to, and I did too. Sometimes they try to interview him on TV, and they actually needed subtitles to talk to the guy because they needed subtitles. He'd be sitting there speaking in English, and he couldn't understand a word. He was worse than Mother Teresa. They were treating to Mother Teresa. You couldn't understand a word, and that'd be Ozzy. He'd be up there talking. Well, for one, he had that, I think, a really working class, from the streets type of British accent. He spoke with an English accent, but I don't think it was the Queen's cotillion English, or Prince Charles approved English to start with, and then he had all those years of and he would get up there and mumble. You couldn't understand a word he said, and I remember they would have subtitles sometimes when he would talk, even though he was just sitting there talking in English, his native language. But over the years, I think people realized he was a very smart man and a very good man and a very decent man, and he was a man who took a lot of chances in his life. I would like Tony Iommi, that whole band, I think. Are they from Birmingham? Some of you, I'm sure, know more about the history of the band than Geezer Butler. I don't know, but a lot of those guys, they could have been working at cruddy factory jobs, and they took big risks by starting that band, and it was a creative band. It was a band that had a huge influence on the arts, and it was an original band, and they had an original music, and it wasn't really derivative. It was great music for what it was. And I think over the years, we never take Ozzy seriously. We don't take musicians seriously anyway. That always kind of ticks me off. Try to imagine if they tried to put a musician on the Supreme Court. Oh, I need the fainting couch, The musicians are always good to have around, good old Charlie. A lot of musicians are smart and probably make a heck of a lot better Supreme Court justices than a lot of the people we've had in there over the years. But anyway, we don't ever take musicians seriously in the first place, and then you add in Ozzy and his kind of colorful backstory and the way he slurred his speech and how he bit the head off a bat, and and just some of the tales of wanton behavior and things, and people don't really take him that seriously. But looking back on it, he's a life that made a big difference. And people have said he was a Christian man. Somebody online said he was a Roman Catholic, but I believe he's Church of England. He's a Protestant, I'm pretty sure. But I'll stand corrected. I thought he was Church of England. Anglican. And, something else you can tell about a man you can judge a man by his friends and also maybe his wife. And he married a pretty smart woman. She saw something in him. And there was loyalty and love there, obviously, all these years. I'm sure she's in mourning right now as I speak these words. So, you can, and I like to see Sharon Osbourne. You'll see her, on the news with Piers Morgan, at the Queen's funeral, or the wedding of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry or something. There's Sharon Osbourne up there opining on the British monarchy and British history, and every once in a while you have to realize this is Ozzy Osbourne's wife. But she's obviously a woman with a lot going on, so that's great. So, but hats off to Ozzy Osbourne. And just thinking, whenever I think of Black Sabbath, I can't help but go back to those years when I lived in Wheaton, Illinois, and some of the attacks on rock and roll in general. But I mean, Black Sabbath, they were they were like the no brainer. I mean, if you, there are a few gray areas in there. Yeah, you can say, well, Boston, they had good guitar. A few gray zone areas, but Black Sabbath, I mean, you listen to Black Sabbath, that was a sin. That was wrong. And and maybe it was. I'm not even saying they were wrong necessarily, because, like I said, I believe also in having happy, healthy, wholesome images fill your mind. But you got to admit, there was some pretty damn good rock and roll on those albums, some pretty great guitar, and some pretty cool lyrics that old Ozzy wrote, and great songs. And something else about Ozzy, a lot of times you take like Tony Iommi's guitar and stuff, and those guys would like these great riffs, but I think Ozzy's kind of like Robert Plant. He's the guy that kind of turns stuff into songs, I think. Because he would come up and start singing, and out of riffs and jams would come actual coherent songs. So R.I.P. to Ozzy Osbourne, and wish the best on all. God bless you on your journey, sir.